Okay. When I want to pose a question to everyone here, while you're eating, you can feel free, anyone who has a response. Is the Seder, in your eyes, more remembering of a sadness, let's say, a time, are we remembering more our enslavement, or are we remembering more our freedom?
Yes.
Yeah, it said yes. Or is it both equally? It sounds like,
I think the ultimate goal is the second thing, but we have to remember the first thing as well.
I think
So the ultimate goal you're saying is the
Ultimate
freedom,
goal.
but while remembering the sadness. Yeah.
change is really hard. And so sometimes you're excited about what's going to happen, but you're also fearful of what's going to happen. And you're also, it's hard to make something different. So it could be both.
Okay.
I think it begins with fear and ends with joy.
Okay, it begins with fear and ends with joy. Okay. Yeah, Helena.
Joy.
No, no worries, no problem.
But it's also the Hag HaAviv. So,
Yeah.
so everything is blue and it's all starting fresh, the novel. So it's uplifting.
Yeah, so it's uplifting, it's spring. I think I mentioned, if you were here on Shabbat, I added a few tunes from Pesach into the Kedusha.
I heard it.
In honor of, right, we're starting about, I guess in a few days, actually, just after Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which according to the Torah, despite the fact that we celebrate Rosh Hashanah, half a year ago, Nisan is really the first month of the year, if you read the Torah. And why? The Torah alludes to this, and all commentators basically agree, right? Nisan was the first month that the Jewish people, the Israelites, were a community that was free. First month that saw a free Israelite Bnei Israel, a free Bnei Israel, is the month of Nisan. And therefore, Nisan is actually just as the beginning of our counting of years. Starts here. There's a celebration of freedom. What does the Talmud actually, or the Mishnah I should mention? One thing I always find fascinating about the Passover Seder is how what we're doing is almost identical in many ways to what our parents did, their parents did, their parents did, going back generations and generations. And when we read the outline of the Passover Seder in the Mishnah, this was written in the year 190 of the Covenant era. It's astounding to me how similar, yes, there are some minor differences, but how similar the basic layout of the Seder is to what was written down in the Mishnah nearly 2,000 years ago, over 1,800 years ago.
But I get the impression today from all the different, the new Haggadot, that they have Noam Zion, they've added so much and have left out some things that you sometimes wonder, are you reading the same Haggadah?
So look, there's a proliferation of Haggadahs is, among the most widely published books in Jewish literature, and there are a ton of different Haggadot. Some may go further astray from the traditional text than others. But I would say that largely Haggadot add, but most Haggadot don't move away from the basic core structure of the Seder.
No, we added the water and we added the orange, and I think there's another thing they've added now.
Yeah, so those are additions, but I would actually argue that there have been additions throughout history. I'll give a few examples. Shfoch chamatcha, I think I've mentioned, pour out your wrath, and the opening of the door to Elijah is an addition from the Middle Ages. In response to the Crusades, we say there's this statement, pour out your wrath among the nations, and opening the door. It was an addition at one point. Now, you don't think of it as an addition because it's 1,000 years old. The song Echad Mi Yodea knows one. you might be familiar with from your seders. Most scholars actually hear about this story, or believe this came about in the 13th century, 14th century. As a Jewish response to a Christian song, actually, who knows one, who knows two, and it stopped at 12 with the 12 apostles being who's 12. The Jewish writer wanted to one up the Christians, saying, we could go up to 13 with it. And it became popular and eventually was adopted into the Haggadah. And not to say that there may be Haggadot, and I'm sure there, with the number of Haggadot that exist, there probably are some Haggadot that move further astray from our tradition. But we do see a lot of additions, that the tradition of adding an orange to the Seder plate is not saying take something away and put an orange, it's saying add to what already exists, put an orange on.
And you won't find it. Oh,
Right, I'm not saying that's a tradition that everyone is going to adopt, but, and I'm not saying, Sheila, there are, I would be wary of communities that are moving so far astray that they're eliminating core elements of the Seder. I give a little plug for anyone who's able to join either right here in person or on Zoom. This evening and the next two Thursday nights, Rabbi Carney Rose is going to be exploring three of the core elements of the Seder. Rabban Gamliel in the Talmud mentions the three core elements: Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, the Paschal offering, the Matzah, and the Maror. And I know he's going to be focusing each week on those three elements, but really kind of delving into those four elements. So I encourage everyone to study with him.
Backing up to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, I had a problem when I was teaching that my boss, who was the dean then, said, didn't you just have a holiday?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right,
And
we're blessed with many holidays.
I said, my response was, we Jews are a very celebratory people.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree.
I think that we should do one change. We should remove Shpok Hamatcha al Hagoyim from the Haggadah.
Good, so, I'm not here I'm not officially able to make any changes broadly, but if you would like to do that at your Seder, I'll actually share that there is precedence to that. I think that we might have spoken about this. Again, what this paragraph that you're referring to is something that was an addition, about 1,000 years ago, but still an addition from the core text. And there are some Haggadot, even dating back 600, 700 years, that have modified this paragraph to say, Shpoch ahavatcha al hagoyim asher yeda'ucha. Pour out your love upon those nations who recognize you, recognize God. And we see that also in some contemporary Haggadot as well. But I want to look, so chapter 10 of Mishnah Pesachim, we're not going to look at largely, but it does today, but it does kind of outline the Seder more or less as we know it, even down to some of the songs that we still sing. It talks about the 4 questions. I will mention, it actually only mentions 3 questions, and one of them is, it mentions 4 questions. One of the questions is different than the questions that we have. It has 3 of the questions that we still say today, and 1 question that's different. And one of the questions is slightly modified. So the question of chametz or matzah is there 1,800 years ago. The question of maror and any vegetable maror is already in the Haggadah over 1,800 years ago.
Mhm.
The question of dipping is there, but slightly different. Because it used to be in meals, we learn actually from this question that every meal involved dipping. The meal was with pita or some sort of bread that you would dip into the sauce or the meal. And so the question says, why on most nights do we dip just once? And this meal we dip twice. We've changed that question to say, why on most nights do we not even dip once? Because today it's not customary to have dipping as part of the meal. The 4th question was a change. But there were 4 questions already 1,800 years ago. Do you want to share, and then I'll share the last
I
question.
think I remember noting this before, but actually, if you look at the exact text of that section, it's 1 question and 4 statements. Why is
Right
the
out-
night different from the night and the rest of the statement?
I'm misleading by calling them 4 questions. That's kind of modern parlance, but in Hebrew, they're actually the arba kushiot, the 4 challenges, or the 4. It's 1 question. That has 4 reasons behind it, right? Why is this night different? And we're listing reasons why it's different.
Yeah,
But good, but you're absolutely correct. The final question, we know today, and I don't know exactly when it came into the Haggadah, but sometime more recently than 1800 years ago, is the question of why on most nights we could sit either sitting regularly or reclining, and why tonight do we only recline? That question came in after the Mishnah, but the Mishnah does have a fourth question, and it says, why on most nights could we eat meat prepared any which way, roasted, boiled, or stewed? But on this night, we specifically eat roasted meat. The reason this question came out of favor, the roasted meat was in remembrance of the Paschal offering, which was roasted. In Ashkenazi world, it actually became taboo to use roasted meat and considered wrong to use roasted meat, lest you really think this is the Paschal offering, which of course hasn't happened since temple times. So
Also, if you're a vegetarian.
if you're a vegetarian, the question might not be so relevant either, but the question kind of went out of parlance as it became somewhat taboo to eat roasted meat, lest you think that this actually is the Paschal offering, and we didn't want people at the Seder to think that we were actually making the Paschal offering in a time without the temple. I will say Sephardi communities, it still is generally the tradition to have roasted meat. And we have roasted meat often at our Seder, and I don't think anyone's going to think we actually offered the Paschal offering. And that's why that question kind of came out of the Seder and out of the four Kuchia. So looking at the paradox, is there anyone that wants to read here? We'll read in English. You can see
I will.
if I can see well enough, I can maybe zoom in for our,
No, it's fine.
it's fine for the people on Zoom. I don't know if is it big enough for people here?
Sure.
Sure, it's fine.
Okay, I can see. We zoomed in a little. So, yeah.
Okay. When teaching his son about the Exodus, he begins with the Jewish people's disgrace and concludes with their glory. And he expounds from the passage. An Aramean tried to destroy my father. The declaration one recites when presenting his first fruits at the temple until he concludes explaining the entire section.
So I'll explain this a little. And actually, if you can think of the Haggadah and are understanding what this is, what it's sharing is actually exactly what we do today. The Mishnah is kind of prescribing that the story should start with the Jewish people's disgrace, their shame, and end with their glory, their praise. And that's what many of you kind of mentioned. The story starts in a hard place, in a difficult place, and ends with this joy and this celebration.
Can I ask just,
Yeah,
this is more of a housekeeping question.
yeah.
Obviously, or maybe it seems obviously that the bold print is the attempted translation of the actual Mishnah.
Yes.
And the non-bold print is somebody else's interpolations. Do you know whose?
Oh, writing this? I don't know whether this was taken from the art,
It's just from Safari.
This is from Safari.
Probably Steinsaltz.
my guess is the Steinsaltz
So-
translation.
I'll just argue with Steinsaltz a little bit that I might have said, when one is teaching one's children, is why should we exclude the women?
No, you're 100% correct. Well, yes, I would probably do that too, and this was pulled from Safari, which I do think uses Steinsaltz's translation. The bolded words are the words that actually appear in the Mishnah, kind of the direct translation. The words that are not in bold are helping the non-Hebrew reader understand the context. They're not meant to be interpretations per se, but any addition to the words is to some degree an interpretation.
Why did they say disgrace?
So the Mishnah tells us that you should begin your story of telling of the Exodus, a biganu, disgrace or shame. I don't know if there's any Hebrew speakers that want to translate that.
Why is it?
So why does it start there? And there's a
No,
lot
I
of
mean-
debate.
Disgrace sounds like you did something awful.
Oh, they started it slave.
So there's actually an argument and our story that we still read today in the traditional Haggadah, there's really kind of two questions. Is this physically we're starting from a place of shame? Is it spiritually we're starting from a place of shame? What does that mean, right? What the writer in its context seems to mean is that we're not starting as free people, we're not starting in the place that we're spiritually where we should be. But right, it's a good question. What does it mean where we begin with this grace? I think the commentators come up with two answers to this. Physically, we're enslaved. We're beginning in a place of physical enslavement. But also spiritually, and if you think about the beginning of the telling of the story in the Magid section, spiritually, we're not yet recognizing God. It talks about our ancestors prayed to idols, we're idol worshipers. And so spiritually, we're starting from a place of disgrace that we weren't able to yet recognize Hashem, recognize Adonai. So I would argue, and not I, really it's the commentators, it's not me, but the commentators of our tradition kind of argue and debate what does it mean to start there, and there's two positions. There's the physical, place of slavery, and there's the spiritual place of idolatry. But we conclude with glory, and of course, the end of the story, we come out of Egypt, we're free. And again, right, the story we read, as you probably noticed if you read the traditional Haggadah many times each year, we're not reading the story of the Exodus. We are actually really reading the commentary on not even the story of the Exodus, but the words that were recited, the declaration that was recited on Shavuot. According to the Torah, the first fruits are brought on Shavuot to the temple, and there's a passage that should be recited, which kind of in very brief, in a few lines, tells the story of the Exodus. And that's already, this is Steinsaltz telling us that that's what happens next, but that's actually already here in the Mishnah. And so does anyone have any example, before we kind of move on, does anyone have any thoughts or examples of ways that we see this paradox in the Seder? The paradox of both remembering the enslavement and the idolatry and our disgrace, our ganut, and also our joy. Yeah.
We end
The Dayenu starts with and ends with.
Okay, Dayenu is a great example. Yeah, who was that? Was that Elon? Oh, Judy.
Yeah,
No,
also on a, not a, well, I want to use the word practical level, we start with the serious stuff, the questions, and then after we eat, it's still a little, well, it's supposed to still have the serious prayers, but then we go into singing. We end it with all these songs.
Okay, great. No, the end of the Seder is intentionally in the Elah. There's joy. There's singing to celebrate our freedom sense of.
I think it's
yeah.
also we're celebrating that we've been able to eat.
Maybe that too. Yeah.
So, I mean, specifically, we talk about the maror as a reminder of the bitterness of slavery. You talk about the choroset as the mortar of the bricks that they were making. We also talk about the plagues. And that's also a sort of a mixture because it's deliverance on the one hand, but somebody else had to suffer on the other. And then we're still also talking about freedom. We talk about that with all four cups, and then maybe the fifth cup, because Elijah is like the future freedom, Pesach Latid, if you will. So it runs throughout.
Okay, right. And even those things that you're mentioning, which recall the enslavement, right? We're doing while reclining, while in a space of freedom. Yeah.
What about on a very personal level? I see some parallels to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, looking back at the past, maybe feeling not so good about some of what we experienced and did, with moving on to a new year and visions of relating more closely to God and being a better Jew. Past.
All the holidays do that, basically. You
Well,
try
many
to
holidays
explain
do your.
why you're doing something
Um,
and expressing hope that you can change things.
Change.
right. Well, Pesach. No, I hear what you're saying. Pesach, and you mentioned Pesach. Pesach Ba'atid. There is a notion, and writers and rabbis and scholars have written about this. Pesach Rishon, that first Pesach, where the people were enslaved. You know, in the rabbinic imagination, in the Talmud's imagination, the first Passover Seder, the first Passover was celebrated while the people were enslaved on the eve of their being departing Egypt. And now we're in kind of the Pesach of today, which is remembering, but we believe in this Pesach Sheyavo, this Pesach La'atid, this Pesach of the future where everyone is free. That we're still in this middle ground. We're not enslaved the way we were to Egypt, but we're not truly free. And that's, you know, in part, we open the door to Eliyahu Hanavi, and we're asking for this future time, the Pesach to come, which will really be true freedom. Yeah.
We start off with halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction,
Yeah.
and we end up with next year in Jerusalem.
Right, beautiful,
Right,
beautiful,
There's a
yeah.
section in the early part, the Behisha Amadar, prayer,
Yeah.
which is things like this have happened. over
Right,
and
it's
over.
applicable at many holidays, actually, as I've
Yeah.
thought about
So
many.
The question is its placement where it is. We're talking, there's some of this kind of discussion in the early part, and then that's there, sort of standing alone.
Right, it almost to me, and I would need to look, I don't have specifics, it kind of happens right before we go through kind of the telling of the passages in the Torah. It's almost like a prelude. That like, this is what's gonna happen in the story. The Hisha Amda literally means, and that person those people who stood up to us, you know, and tried to destroy us. But we were able to overcome them essentially. And it kind of is a prelude to the story saying, this is like the too long don't read, like it's the cliff notes at the beginning of the story saying they're gonna come to try to kill us, but we survived, right? Well, we
Yeah,
escaped.
let's eat.
And then let's see, right, the non-written postscript is let's eat, right? But good. But the paradoxes do abound in the Seder. You mentioned the maror, the bitterness, and the charoset, the mortar. The charoset is a little trickier actually, and we'll look here for a minute at what the charoset, where charoset is, because charoset is actually already mentioned here in the Mishnah. I pulled this is after we mention the various things on the Seder plate, which are obligatory, the matzah, the maror. The charoset is not a mitzvah, but merely a custom, is actually what the Mishnah says, but they already knew about charoset 1800 years ago, it was already part of the Seder. There just is a debate about whether it's required or not. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Tzadok comes back and says, no, it is a mitzvah to eat charoset. There's already a debate. What does the charoset represent? David, you mentioned it represents the mortar.
One thing, yeah.
How is charoset made? How do you make your charoset?
Chop up things.
Apples, wine,
I like it with dates.
nuts, dates.
Sweet and
Cinnamon.
sour.
Cinnamon,
In a way.
does it sound bitter?
No,
Yes, I don't know.
What do you make it the Sephardi way or the Ashkenazi way? They're not ingredients that come to mind when you think of bitter. But right, and we still teach our students, I suppose, that it comes from building the mortar, which is ostensibly bitter. Bitterness of slavery.
Saying moderates the bitter when you eat them together.
Right, maybe it moderates the bitter, and that's, we're gonna read, this is the Talmud, comments in that chapter. The Mishnah states that they bring the charoset to the leader of the Seder, although eating charoset is not a mitzvah. That, by the way, is the position that is adopted. We saw there's a debate, a machloket, and ultimately what's passed down through generations is that while charoset is a long-standing custom, it's not a mitzvah. But why do we have it? What reason does one bring it to the Seder?
Whenever we start something, we never remove it, though.
Yeah. Once it's there, it's there. That's kind of the way of the Seder. To some degree, that could be true. Rabbi Ami says it's brought due to the poison in the bitter herbs. Actually, what David, who just mentioned, to mute the taste of the bitter herbs, which is neutralized by the charoset. In this regard, Rav Asi said the remedy for one who ate the poison in lettuce is to eat a radish. So this is bringing other examples that the Talmud brings up. These are ways to dilute the bitterness. Things, right? The remedy for the poison in a radish You're having your whole meal right here.
Or like
The remedy for the poison in leeks is not water, the remedy for the poison in all vegetables is not water.
What word is being translated as poison?
The lettuce.
No,
So what word is being poison? Let me see.
No,
Uh,
it's the next
what's here?
page. The
Sorry.
chamime. Chamime.
The hulho chamime. No. Chamime is the house.
Yes.
Kafa, maybe kafa.
I'm trying to find the right word.
I mean, I'm asking,
Yeah, what's your?
I'm wondering whether poison is the right choice of translation or not.
Whether we like.
Do we need poison or do we just need,
Bitter. So it's a good question. We need to look at what the word is. The way they're using poison and what things they're talking about with poison kind of lends it to be like something that's bitter, tasting. Not something that's gonna actually poison you. Per se, but.
Word used many times here.
because you have this whole hierarchy of what removes poison from what, which kind of is begging the question, why don't we just go straight to the corrosive, which is sweet, and counteract the bitterness with that? Unless, of
Right.
course, I'm missing something, and that's why I asked.
It helps to accept the bitterness in our lives.
Okay. Good, no, I like that.
We actually also in our own Seder, we try to follow this idea of eating the bitter herb, as the bitter herb, but then when do you eat the corrosive? So then the idea, we do it twice, so to speak, once with and once without,
Yeah.
so that, everybody's happy.
This, I think this is it. Kappa.
Like the poison.
This is
You don't
this
see
is
it.
the word
What
that I'm highlighting.
What about the incantation at the end? It says poison,
right.
poison, I
Yeah.
remain.
So this is the incantation. So kappa, this is the poison. I'm not sure. I'm
Yeah,
not my Aramaic. I need to look up where what other places this word is.
even
used.
talking about an incantation, it already seems to be coming from the, the setting of the Talmud Bavli, which is amongst the Persian dominated society in Iraq, which believed in magic.
Well, so there is, I don't want to get so far into that, but it's true. This is coming from a time where there was a different understanding of magic and incantations, yeah.
Yeah.
What's latit? What's latit? That seems to appear a few times.
It is like
Zecher Latif, remember Latif?
So the teeth is the clay, is the mortar, The teeth is the mortar. Well,
That's
It's
interesting
the
because that's
mortar.
nowhere, that does not appear anywhere unless that's what they're using for poison, because that doesn't appear
No.
anywhere in the English.
so Zecher Latif, we'll get to that in just a minute here. But but in the meantime, when one is waiting for someone to bring him the remedy, there's this incantation.
Yeah, and your 7 daughters, wow.
And then, then the Mishnah, the Talmud continues to say, the Mishnah says that Rabbi Elazar ben Rav Tzadok says eating corrosive is a mitzvah. What is the nature of this mitzvah? And here there's actually 2 answers. The answer we're most common with is the Zecher Latit, which already appears in the Talmud. Why do we have corrosive? It's to remind us of the mortar, the bitterness. But actually, the corrosive in itself is a paradox, just like we saw the Seder as a whole being a paradox. Rabbi Levi says in remembrance of the apple, and I didn't pull the other source here right now, but in Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs refers to the tapuach, right? Do you want to share? Yeah. Right, the tapuach is the sweetness among the trees of the forest.
Also, tapuach is from the original seed.
Tell us if the tapuach, what's the tree? But
Please understand it.
now, tapuach are great. In fact, what you say, the tapuach is sweet.
Wait a minute,
versus.
we're losing your voice, the audio.
Say, or to the.
So the rabbis don't understand, the British rabbis don't understand that. Well, but the Puach that's here in Shir Hashirim is really about the sweetness. The charosah is actually supposed to remind us of the sweetness, maybe the sweetness of say Haya, or the trees of the forest, the sweetness of spring, the sweetness of freedom. You know, this paradox is that on one hand, the charosah reminds us of enslavement and the mortar that we were required to build, and on the other hand, the sweetness of freedom.
But we make the charoset with tabon, original.
Yeah. Well,
With egozim.
so exactly, although we might not have learned originally, or we may not, focus and dwell on the fact that it's zecher l'tapuach, the charoset, the sweetness, it has carried its way into our recipes, whether you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi, whether it's dates and dates and walnuts, or the apples and walnuts and wine, whatever it is, you'll be hard pressed to find charoset that isn't sweet. I'll give, are a couple examples, right? In Gibraltar, it became the tradition to put actual brick shavings in your charoset. It's not so sweet, maybe bringing the paradox of sweetness with the actual brick shavings that you could bite into.
In the Civil War.
Correct. Civil War, when they weren't able to make the charoset, they took an actual brick and just put it on the Seder plate. It's the representation of the charoset, and it's become well known during the Civil War that they used an actual brick.
Going back to the incantation, what's with the 7 daughters and 8 daughters? Vice versa.
Good question. So I didn't have a chance to really look so closely into that. I can pull that up again. If anyone has any thoughts, I'm open to hearing them, but it says poison, poison. I remember you, your 7 daughters and your 8 daughters in law. So it might be
7
someone.
daughters, But 8 daughters-in-law.
They smell well, they smell good.
They smell good. I actually need to look this one up. I can get back to you. And maybe someone in the Talmud who had 7 daughters and 8 daughters-in-law, and it was like calling on that person.
The numbers are also interesting while you're looking it up. Why
They are,
7
yeah.
and 8?
Sorry, the Zecher Latit somehow didn't make it into the English translation. I'm not sure why, but that's the remembrance of the mortar. I don't have a good.
When did it change over?
When did it change over? Well, it didn't change. It's not that it changed over. There is already a debate about what it is 1,800 years ago. And that debate, that paradox, that it's both for sweet and for bitter, has maintained itself in some way until today. But I don't know that anything's changed. Perhaps in certain places, it was more about the remembrance of the sweet. And I think we've kind of, in our own practice, whether you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi, what we usually tell is that the remembrance of the mortar, but when you actually taste it, it's the remembrance of the sweet. So it's in some ways kind of both together. So we also see that the karpas is kind of the sign of spring, whether it might not be sweet, but it's a remembrance of something positive, of this springtime, but we dip it in the salt water, which is reminding us of the bitterness. So the same kind of paradox as they're going together, the karpas. We have one student in our religious school who says her favorite food is the parsley dipped in salt water, like her favorite food about like any food in the world. Is the parsley in salt water. Nelson, yeah.
I believe that the horseradish is actually a poison and it irritates your throat, which is why it feels good, as is mustard. And these things that are sour, really bitter, are really poisons. And I'm wondering if the rabbis understood something that we had lost for a long time and now have regained.
It's very possible. They saw it as poison in some sense. It's hard to, I could look at what the commentaries say, and it's hard to know exactly what they meant by poison, but Nelson, I think that's a great point. Now, Passover really, as we talked about here, is really about past, present, and future. And we talked about that first Pesach in slavery, the Pesach, really since then, we call it the Pesach of today, but really it's every Pesach but that very first one. And we dream about the Pesach L'Atid, the Pesach of the future.
When the Mashiach comes.
So there was oppression in the past, there's oppression in the present. And, you know, God willing, there won't be oppression in the future, but we still see oppression. So why are we, you know what? We're celebrating, and, you know, I think this may be even particularly poignant this year, from slavery to freedom. I'm gonna turn to everyone here, you know, what does it mean to celebrate? You know, thank God, you know, we're in a position in our lives today where we're neither enslaved nor are we fully free. And I think that's part of what this paradox is, that we're actually in neither place absolutely. But what does it mean to be in this middle place? And what does it mean to think of enslavement when things are good? And what does it mean to think of freedom when we know there's so much suffering going on, and particularly with everything happening in Israel this year? You know, what does that, how does celebrating Passover kind of speak to us? What message
Good question.
can we take from Passover?
Hope.
Hope? Okay. Any other thoughts? I think that's beautiful.
In spite of everything, we keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, in spite of everything, we keep going.
If we celebrate, then we're saying that we know there's a chance for things to get better.
Okay, there's a chance for things to get better, right?
Even in the concentration camps, they used to try to do some celebration.
Right.
They saved a piece of bread or something with the hope that it will get better.
Great. So I want to share, this is, you know, written by a teacher of mine, Rabbi Danny Nevins, who was rabbi in Detroit and later the dean of the rabbinical school at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Shared a little about this idea of past, present, and future. And I think on the one hand, right, we, even in the worst of times, and you mentioned celebrating the Passover Seder in the concentration camps. We want, you know, we want to remember the good that exists. And at the same time, and this is Rabbi Nevins, writes, right, there were redemptions in the past and there are redemptions in the present, but what about the future? And he writes, if we are unwilling to acknowledge that which is deeply dysfunctional in our day, if we are always saying, well, at least we're not slaves, then we are missing the major point of Passover and evading responsibility for making things better. The holiday ought not cultivate indolence, but rather indignation, not contentment, but rather contrarians. We live in a time where there is literal enslavement, and there is also misery on a massive scale. He talks about also, this was written a number of years ago, talks about the number of global refugees in the world, those who are not free, those who are not, you know, at home, who might not have the peace and hope that we hope for everyone. Passover is saying, yes, you know, on the one hand, we enjoy everything that we have, but on the other hand, it pokes at that indifference. And he writes, right, it alerts us not to sit back and enjoy our relatives' safety and prosperity too much. It's designed to keep us off balance. That we, at the same time we are thinking about our freedom, we're also thinking about our enslavement. We can never move too far to one end. We always need to keep a balance, to recognize the blessings in our lives, but also all of the work that needs to be done to make this world a better place. And that's really, you know, from our traditions, the original Pesach when we were enslaved, and the future Pesach, you know, God willing, one day to be where we are all free, a day of Messiah. You know, our Pesach today is about recognizing that middle place and working towards that Atid Sheyavo, that Passover that will come one day when we're all free. And we allude to that when we open the door for Eliyahu. We allude to that when we say, L'Shana Haba Yerushalayim. You know, we say in the next year in Jerusalem, the full line really is Jerusalem, Yerushalayim Habnuya, the rebuilt Jerusalem. And in the rabbinic interpretation, today, you know, we're blessed that Jerusalem is rebuilt, you know, in the 75 years, almost 76 years, and God willing, things will get better there, you know, in terms of what's happening today. When the rabbis talk about Yerushalayim Habnuya, yes, this is a start of that, but really they're talking about the rebuilding of the temple. The Beit HaMikdash, the rebuilt Jerusalem really refers to the rebuilt Beit HaMikdash, the rebuilt temple. And that alludes in rabbinic understanding to a time when the Mashiach is here, and there's freedom and there's peace and there's a readiness among, you know, in the entire world to have that temple, to have that pure, the most pure place to connect with God. And so while we are, you know, stuck in this middle time, the way the rabbis interpret, may we continue to find ways to reach that Pesach She'avo. May we continue to do our part to bring peace to the world, to make the world a better place. And so it's great learning with everyone. I'll turn to any last questions or thoughts or comments.
Maybe in another session, you can speak about kitnios.
Kitnios, that's a different topic, but I can make note of it. And you should definitely, there are more sessions. I don't know exactly. I'll mention the next couple of weeks, but Rabbi Josh Kahan and Rabbi Matt Berkowitz are joining us each of the next 2 weeks. They're going to be joining via Zoom, but certainly there will be lunch for anyone who's able to come in person and join from here. And there, you know, it's certainly something to bring up. Next week, Rabbi Josh Kahan just published a new Haggadah, which he'll share about and delve into with everyone here. Kitniot Kitniot is a later addition, 1800 years ago. There's no talk of Kitniot actually in the Mishnah. Really, this is a Sephardi Ashkenazi divide. And even Ashkenazim, today there have been responses in the conservative movement and elsewhere that say it's not really, it's a long-standing custom, but there's not the same halachic weight. Although Rabbi David Galinkin, who's the chief, he's the leader of the conservative rabbinical seminary, the Masorti Seminary in Jerusalem, Machon Schechter, wrote a responsa on how there's no halachic weight to the kitniot, and you should be fine to eat kitniot. There's no issue. In fact, it's based on some ignorance, and you should eat kitniot. And then I was plans where he thought you shouldn't refrain. So someone asked, well, do you eat kitniot on Pesach? He says, no, my wife won't allow it in our kitchen. So there's one custom. Yeah, Sheila.
Apparently, my husband's relative, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, wrote a book, and he is the one quoted in the seminary. He was an Orthodox, rabbi, but he was quoted in by the conservative movement by Reisner as the source for kitniot. So this is going back to like 1800s. Now I know that in my mother-in-law's house they did not have kitniot, even though he had written this.
Right. So I will end by, I'm not going to tell you whether or not you should have, whether or not you can decide your own personal practice, but there's not really halachic standing for not eating kitniot. The biggest challenge, and this is less the case now with the Grove and other places coming to Cleveland, it was very hard to find things that were labeled kosher for Passover for those who ate kitniot. Now it's a little easier to find that actually. But I will eat kitniot, I'll say, but it needs to, if it's not like the plain ingredients itself, it would need to be labeled, which was very hard to find, although it's becoming a little easier to find.
Mark's has quinoa kosher for Passover.
Right.
But quinoa, if it comes from a barrel,
I know, but it actually has the texture. It actually has the
right, if it's textured, right. If it's plain quinoa, it may not need, depending on how it's.
It depends where it comes from, apparently. There are two
If it's labeled, then it's definitely. But then any other last comments? Right.
But in Europe, I read about it. In Europe, there were places where they used to mix.
Well, right.
So that's where it
right.
came.
The reason it derives, and most stories and most people will say it derives from a time when there was concern that that these items were mixed with grains in warehouses and in barrels, and therefore, if you were eating them, it might be cross-contaminated with
Yeah.
with chametz. Today, that's not a concern, that's not a concern we're worried about. However, if it's not the plain ingredient itself, it would need to still be labeled kosher l'Pesach. And that being said, if you have a long-standing custom not to eat kitniot, you should feel good in that decision.
I feel, it's 1 week, so you eat differently.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
I was gonna say, so that's the one big change in my life is kitniot. What about the other change of having one Seder? Will that ever happen?
So that's an interesting question. It's unlike, I mean, if you go to Israel, yes, it has. Let's see.
That's why I'm asking.
If American citizens go to Israel, they still celebrate Tuesday.
Well,
You're supposed to.
So yes, there is a general traditional understanding that you should still celebrate Seders, and if you're Israeli visiting the United States, you won't celebrate one Seder. In practice, it's always not so easy to do, because in Israel, just about everyone is only celebrating a bunch Seder. But yes, and also there is also a custom, and there's some halacha written about the fact that if you spend a year in Israel, a full year, it's as though you can adopt the Israeli practice of one Yom Tov and one Seder. But all of these there are various opinions on all of this today. But thank you so much. For being and great to learn together with you. I just want to share this evening. I hope many of you will be able to join, whether in person or on Zoom, with Rabbi Carney Rose. His topics will the P's and Q's of Pesach, really focusing. No, Thursday night. But tonight here, I'm going to stable a little
Is it being
smaller.
recorded? Is it being
It
recorded?
will be recorded, yes, it will be recorded, but it's on Zoom and in person.
What time?
Right here, 7 p.m. And it will also be April 11th and April 18th, both here in person on Zoom. And as well, I mentioned the lunch and learns will happen, and God willing, Rabbi Jacobs will be back shortly after Passover. But it's great to have. Great to see everyone, and I wish everyone an early Shabbat Shalom and an early Chag Sameach. We're starting to talk about Pesach.